Hi, how are you doing? I thought I would do a little series of videos on key scholars. So, what I mean by this is scholars that come up in more than one place on the course. And what prompted me to do this was looking back through some old work and particularly looking at work from the actual exams of some of my students who hadn't done as well as they hoped. And one of the reasons was they didn't seem to have quite as good a grasp of the scholars as they needed. So I think with our course, it's very easy to think, oh, I'll just learn the topics. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's, we would encourage you to learn the topics, obviously. But when you've got some thinkers that go across the whole course, it's really, really useful to have what you might call a more holistic understanding of them. So understanding more about where they're coming from, and because that can help you see similarities. So today I want to do a deep dive on Aquinas, because Aquinas is possibly the scholar that comes up more places than anywhere else. So I'll try not to make this too long, but hopefully it will be helpful. Here we go. All right, now you would never be asked about this stuff, but I think it's worth knowing a little bit of background to some of these thinkers, just so that you start thinking of them as people who had a body of work rather than just as little snippets. So Aquinas' dates were 1225 to 1274. A lot of people don't realise that he was that early. So the church was still kind of finding itself at this point. It was still developing. But the Catholic Church was very powerful. And Aquinas was a part of the Catholic Church. So he studied in Naples, and he particularly focused on the work of Aristotle. He was a big, big fan of Aristotle, and Aristotle was a huge influence on him. That becomes important when we're looking at him in the context of ethics, because you can really see that Aristotelian influence on him. So he went on to blend quite a lot of Aristotle's ideas into Christian theology, and we'll see that when we look at natural moral law. He also believed that studying the natural world would lead to a greater understanding of God's plan. This is interesting to me because that shows me that at a time when science as we know it today didn't really exist, Aquinas sort of was a bit of a scientist, because he believed that even though he was a deeply religious man, believed in God and ultimately believed that God was the source of everything, he was curious and he thought that you could learn about God by looking at the world. Now, looking at the world and how it works is kind of what science is. So we can see that similarity there. And then his thinking, which is known kind of collectively as Thomism, but again, you won't be asked that, became a kind of a jumping off point for the next few hundred years, both in Western philosophy, and I'm including ethics in that as well, and also he was a massive influence on the Catholic Church. So Aquinas is a very, very, very big deal, and it's worth knowing that as we're going in. Okay, so one of the first places that you might have encountered Thomas Aquinas is in year one philosophy. So this is the cosmological argument, Aquinas' third way. We also know it as the argument from contingency and necessity. So here's how it goes. Here's how we set it out. So firstly, we can observe that things in our universe go in and out of existence, and they rely on something else for their existence. Almost everything is like that. In fact, pretty much everything we can observe is like that, because if you look around the room that you're in and look at all the things that exist, there was a time when they didn't exist, and presumably there'll be a time again when they don't exist. So they're contingent. They rely on something else for their existence. And we're like that too. We rely on our parents for our existence. If everything was like this, though, there would be a time when nothing existed, And then presumably nothing would have come to exist because nothing can come from nothing. So Aquinas got that far and then came to the conclusion that there had to be at least one necessary being. So a necessary being is the opposite of a contingent being. A necessary being doesn't owe its existence to anything else. This, he concluded, was the God of classical theism. In other words, the Christian God. Okay, let's move on. So a few things I want you to notice here. This is as part of our attempt to understand Aquinas a little bit more holistically. So he's making his argument from observations of the universe. Like we said, he's a bit of a scientist. And because he's doing that, this makes it an a posteriori argument. So its basis is in observation. It's not based on logic. He's not trying to argue from definitions in the way that Anselm did. He's looking at the world and how it works. Now, because he's doing that, his conclusion can only ever be probably true. It couldn't ever be logically or definitely true because it's not that kind of argument. So this is an inductive argument rather than a deductive argument. He's basing his argument on scientific observations of how the world seems to work. So he's looking around, he's investigating how the world seems to behave. And this is significant because he actually does the same when he's coming up with his ethical system, natural moral law, which we're coming on to. And then finally, he concludes that the necessary being must be the Christian God. But that's not surprising that he would conclude that because he already believes in that God. It's the centre of his existence. So a big flaw that people always point out with the cosmological argument, particularly Aquinas' version of it here, is saying, well, why does that have to be God? Now, that's a fair point because maybe it doesn't have to be God, but for Aquinas, it was always going to be God because he already believes in that God. So you've got to not forget that really kind of before anything else, he is a Christian. Okay, so let's have a look at some strengths and weaknesses just quickly. I'm not going to go deep into this because you can find that elsewhere in my videos. I'm also going to try and do one of these deep dive videos for David Hume as well, because he's quite a big deal. So let's just quickly look at some strengths. Firstly, the argument's reasonable. It's based on observations. It's pretty much factually correct that things do come and go in and out of existence. We can see that happening. It provides a fairly reasonable explanation for why anything exists at all. So it works on that level. And it's compatible with Christian teaching about creation. You could make this work with the Genesis story. And by the way, Aquinas would not have thought that story was literally true. This idea of taking Genesis literally is quite a recent phenomenon. Aquinas would have seen that story in the Bible as a story that's trying to tell us something about God. But if you were a Christian and you cared about this sort of thing, Aquinas' third way is compatible with that because we've got an all-powerful God making things happen, just like we've got in Genesis. So weaknesses. The argument might commit the fallacy of composition. Now again, I've got more about this in another video. The fallacy of composition, an example of it is this idea that every person has a mother, therefore the whole human race has a mother. Well, it doesn't. It doesn't work like that. But I've said it might commit the fallacy of composition because depending on how you phrase the argument, there are some ways out of that. You could argue that we know better now. Theories like the Big Bang Theory provide a far better explanation for the existence of the universe. And that might be true, but Aquinas wouldn't have known that. So we can't really hold that against him. Infinite regress may be possible. Aquinas didn't accept that the universe could go back in time infinitely. He thought it had to have a beginning. Not everybody would agree with him. And then we've got a little bit of David Hume here. And again, I'm going to try and do more on Hume in another video. Why does the necessary being have to be God? Why does it have to be the God of classical theism? Could it not be perhaps the universe itself is the necessary being? Okay, so we'll move on from that now. Let's have a little look. Let's jump forward to year 2 philosophy. Now, in these videos, if I come across some content that you haven't covered yet, don't worry. Just maybe skip it until you have covered it, or treat this as a little introduction. But I know that people get taught this course in different orders and at different speeds. So if we're coming to something that's not familiar to you, don't panic, you will be getting there. So, in religious language, Aquinas thought that the best way to talk about God was through analogy. So analogies are comparisons of things, trying to say that something is a little bit like something else. Now, the thing with an analogy is you have to accept that there aren't any perfect ones. So all analogies are a bit flawed, and Aquinas knew this, but he wasn't really bothered about the whole argument of, is it meaningful to talk about God? Because he kind of assumed that it was, because he believed in God. So his objective was more to say, well, what can we successfully say about God? And there are some problems with religious language. So there are problems of whether it's cognitive or non-cognitive. When people use it, are they trying to be factual or not? And then this univocal equivocal problem. This is the idea that when we talk about God, we're not talking about God in exactly the same way as we would talk about other things, because that would be anthropomorphism, and that's not good. But also, we're not talking about God as being completely different, because then God's completely disconnected from us. So Aquinas' analogies quite nicely avoid that, as I'm about to explain. So here we go, he's got 2. We've got analogy of attribution and analogy of proportion. So analogy of attribution, this is to do with attributes. So because God created us, presumably, we have some of his attributes. So those might be goodness, wisdom, kindness, whatever. By looking at the creation, so by looking at ourselves, we can tell something about the creator. Not everything, not even necessarily very much, but something. It gives us a way in. So the example in the textbook, and I don't know if this actually was Aquinas' example, might be, might not. You can look at the urine of a bull. That's a bit of a weird example, but bear with me. If the urine is healthy, it can tell us something about the health of the bull. So if you get a urine sample from a bull and it's completely healthy, you can probably say from that, even if you can't see the bull itself, that this is a relatively healthy bull. Won't give us much more than that, but that's not nothing. It is something. We can therefore look at human attributes, and this can give us a way of talking about God as our creator. So by looking at what humans can do and what humans are like, we can get a little tiny bit of a sense of what God is like and what God can do. And then analogy of proportion, this is kind of projecting up and down. So again, the starting point is the idea that we've got some of God's qualities, but because we know that we're limited and God's not limited, it would make sense to say that he's got those qualities proportionally much, much more. So Hick tried to give him a hand with explaining this. Hick used the example of a dog's loyalty being proportionally less than a human's loyalty. So a dog can be loyal in the sense that, you know, they'll sit with you, they'll come when you call them, they'll be your friend, but they're not capable of loyalty in such complex ways as humans are. So we can understand that there's like a proportional gap there. So just as we can do that, we can then kind of project up and suppose that proportionally, God's also got loyalty, but it's much, 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 much greater than ours. So again, the thinking here is that to use analogies to say something about God, gives us a way into talking successfully about God, whilst dodging some of the pitfalls that come with using religious language. Okay, let's move on to the next bit. Right, let's do some ethics. I find that people don't make good connections between their philosophy and ethics knowledge. So they tend to put, Aquinas' philosophy stuff in one box and his ethics stuff in another box, and don't really make any links between them. That's not a good idea, because firstly, making those links is going to help you massively with things like dialogues. And secondly, there are similarities to be had. And if you look at it in the round, you can get an overall better understanding of it. So I've put some examples here. So Aquinas, like I've said, observed the way the world works, and this led him to conclude that there must be natural laws built into the universe. The universe behaves predictably. That led him to his ideas about arguments for the existence of God, but it also led him down this path of natural moral law. So the thinking there is actually quite similar. Another thing to remember, particularly for ethics, is the Aristotle stuff. He was very, very heavily influenced by Aristotle. And above all, we've said this, he was a Christian. So we're talking about philosophy and ethics here, but if you're looking for an example of Christian thinking to use in a Christianity answer or a Christianity ethics dialogues answer, absolutely use Aquinas. He's not one thing or another. He's not a philosopher or an ethicist or a Christian. He's all three at the same time. Make that work for you. So where's he starting from with ethics? So his main principle is what he called the synderesis rule. Good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. And again, he observed that. He observed that when human beings are going through life, that's generally how they try to do it. He didn't observe too many people who were actively trying to be evil. People were generally motivated by doing good. And he thought that because humans were rational, whereas animals and plants weren't, humans could work out what was good and what was bad from nature, because we've got the capacity to do that in the way that animals and plants don't. By the way, this here is a bit of Aristotle. This is what we call the hierarchy of souls. So again, he's borrowed this and he's given it kind of a Christian spin. So to do an example, a key need for humans is to survive. We're always trying to protect ourselves. We're trying to preserve our own lives. So this tells us that if we're doing that for ourselves, that must mean that human life is precious and important. So if my life is precious and important, it follows that your life is precious and important as well. And from this, we can figure out how to treat each other, which is the basis of ethics. And here's the key. Aquinas didn't think you had to be a Christian to understand this. And he's not getting this from the Bible. He's getting this from just observing the universe and how humans appear to work. So that leads us on to the primary precepts. So if you've done natural moral law, you'll hopefully be very, very familiar with these. Preserve innocent life, innocent human life, I should say. Reproduce, educate children, live in an ordered society, worship God. These were the things Aquinas thought humans needed to thrive. Now we could argue about that. We could argue that not everyone feels the need to worship God, not everyone feels the need to reproduce, blah, blah, blah. But this was what he concluded. I think it's important here that we just throw in the idea of this part of natural moral law being teleological, because it's best to think of these as goals rather than rules. These are not things that you have to do. These are more kind of like outcomes you're trying to achieve. So you might be thinking, but I've learned that natural moral law is deontological. I'll come back to that in a second, because it sort of is. What's the end goal of life? Just sticking with the teleological, end-based theme with me for a minute. For Aquinas, there were two main goals of life. First one was human flourishing, eudaimonia, being your best self, and he's had that straight out of Aristotle's thinking. And then the Christian aspect is kind of the Christian view of life after death, what Aquinas called the beatific vision, being in the presence of God for eternity. So if you want those things, and he thinks that humans should want these things, then you have to live a life that's going to get you there. So let's just get into the deontological, teleological thing for a sec. Deontological is not a word Aquinas would have used. That was a word that came along much, much later. Natural moral law doesn't fit neatly into a category, but when we get to the secondary precepts, it does become much more deontological, because knowing the goals, knowing the primary precepts, leads us to the rules. So a deontological ethical theory is a rule-based theory, and there are rules you have to follow in order to achieve those goals. So for example, we've got a primary precept of preserve innocent human life. This shows us that killing innocent humans must be wrong, because that wouldn't be preserving their life, that wouldn't be achieving that goal. Therefore, we can see that we can make a rule there, and we can have a secondary precept, which is something like, do not kill innocent people. Now, sometimes people ask me, how many secondary precepts are there? How long is a piece of string? There aren't a fixed number of them. You have to work them out. And you can work out new ones all the time. So you work them out from the primary precepts. So let's do another one. Primary precept could be live in an ordered society. The secondary precept, or a secondary precept that could come from that, could be do not steal, because in an ordered society you need to be confident that your stuff won't be stolen, therefore you can't steal other people's. And then another one, straight away from the same primary precept, could be don't break promises, because in an ordered society you need to be able to trust people. Now obviously you have to go ahead and apply Aquinas' thinking to lots of different ethical issues. We're not going to get into that now, but this is how you do it. You just start from the primary precepts and think, right, if these are the goals, what are the rules? How do we get there? And the how do we get there gives you the rules, gives you the secondary precepts, but there aren't a fixed list of them. Right, let's talk about virtues for a second. Aquinas was very impressed, very influenced by Aristotle's virtue ethics. So he did incorporate some of the virtues into natural moral law, because he thought that this was actually going to be helpful. So he's allowing for some flexibility in the secondary precepts, because he recognised that not every situation was exactly the same. So he's using these virtues in a similar way that Aristotle did, actually. These are really, really helpful to have to help you make good decisions. So we've got 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, and 3 theological virtues, which he would have added. So these are coming out of Christianity: faith, hope, and love. Love is sometimes translated as charity. So it's not necessarily love as in agape love. So where do these fit? Well, they don't fit neatly into natural moral law, but he's working on the basis of the more virtuous you are, the easier it will be to get natural moral law right. That's probably the best way to think of it. The other thing that he developed to help you get natural moral law right was double effect. Now this can be tricky, so it's worth looking at sort of 2 or 3 times. The reason it's called double effect is because it was devised to help you out in a situation where there were going to be two outcomes, possibly a good one and a bad one. So here's how it works. It's permitted to do a good action with an unintended bad consequence, but you can't perform a bad action to achieve a good consequence. So the example we've got here is a self-defense one. Let's have a look at it. If someone attacked you, you have a right to act to defend yourself to a reasonable extent. If, as a result, the attacker ended up getting hurt or even killed, this would not be your fault because all you've done is acted to preserve your life. So if someone comes at you with a knife, you put your hands up to defend yourself, you knock them over and they accidentally stab themselves in the neck, that's not your fault because you did not intend to do that. But you are not allowed to intend to hurt or kill your attacker or use force greater than what was needed to defend yourself. So you're allowed to act to preserve your own life. You are not allowed to act to hurt or kill the other person. Now, this can be applied in all sorts of ways. Abortion is quite an interesting area where it can be applied. Euthanasia. Sometimes it's more helpful than others. So let's just look at a little evaluation of it. It can give some help in complicated situations while staying true to the principles of natural moral law. That's what Aquinas designed it for in the first place. It might help out. You can see how it can apply to things like passive euthanasia, where you're intending to relieve suffering rather than hasten death. So it might give you a little bit more flexibility there. But presumably it's open to misuse. Somebody could claim that a bad thing they've done was simply an unintended consequence. And also, how do you truly know someone's intention, including your own? So an example here from the textbook is a soldier permitted to sacrifice himself to save others, or would he have intended his own death, which is not permitted? Suicide isn't allowed under natural moral law because that's not preserving innocent life. So if a soldier throws himself on a grenade knowing that he will die, is that actually wrong? Seems counterintuitive. So not everybody loves double effect. Right. That's everything on the spec that you need to know for Aquinas. But I've put a little bit of bonus content in here because he does come up somewhere else as well. He comes up in year 2 ethics in the conscience topic. The reason this is bonus though is they cannot ask you specifically questions about particular scholars, but you need a range. You need a range of religious views, you need a range of non-religious views. So it's a very good idea to know what he says along with the other thinkers. So here we go, last bit. For Aquinas, conscience is the God-given gift of reason. Now, if you think about what we've just said about natural moral law, that totally tracks. That totally fits with what we already know about him. So he argues that we've got a natural inclination to obey the synderesis rule, to try to do good and to avoid doing evil. And we arrive at this kind of way of being, we arrive at natural moral law, in fact, through reason. So we can think our way to it. So conscience is essentially this process in action. So if you're following natural moral law, if you are using your reason to make good choices, that's your conscience in action. So Aquinas said, if we do that, if we use our reason to follow conscience and we make a mistake, we're not really to blame for that because we're doing our best. We're doing what we thought our reason was telling us to do. But, and this is where it gets Christian, he also thought that people had to kind of educate their consciences and inform their consciences by following church teaching. So To give you an example, if your conscience told you to do one thing, but the teaching of the church was completely the opposite, you should very much stop and think, because he would say that there will probably be something that's gone wrong there. Okay, so that was pretty brief, that bit, but like I say, that was just bonus content. Thanks for bearing with me for half an hour. Hopefully that's been helpful. Like I say, I will try and do this for John Hick and David Hume, but that might take me a little bit of time. So in the meantime, work hard, feel free to ask questions, and I'll see you soon.